Hello everybody, Father Andrew here. Before we get into this guide, bit of a foreword. This guide was made specifically around applying the taxidermy process to an edible brown crab, so it may not be perfect for all species, but it will very likely work for crabs of similar build or size. However, smaller specimens may not require the stuffing steps to keep them structurally stable, or they may be too fragile to thread wire into in the first place. So take this guide as general guidance and not as an exact step-by-step process. Anyway, moving on, regarding materials, for this process you'll need the following. 1. Tissue paper, toilet paper, or paper napkins to use as stuffing. The material must be easy to cut and stuff inside the shell. 2. Super glue. I personally recommend an XXL bottle of Loctite brand super glue for this, maybe 2 bottles if the crab is larger. 3. A spool of thin PVC or steel wire around a diameter of 0.8mm. The kind they use for gardening is my personal recommendation, but do not get the thick wire they use for suspending climbing plants, it'll be much too hard to bend. 4. Your crab specimen, prepared. And 5. Tools to prepare said crab, which we're going to go over. In reference to preparing the crab, before you can even begin the taxidermy process, you must clean the crab out entirely and be careful as to not break the shell. The exact tools you can use in this process varies greatly, but I personally recommend investing in a seafood tool set as pictured. The red arrows on this image pointing towards the 2 tools I primarily used, albeit the other tools I have found personally useful in other specimens. Anyway, once you have these tools, begin by carefully popping all the crab's joints open and extracting all the flesh. This is ideally performed with a cooked crab as the meat can be safely consumed. However, do not eat the gills, referred to as dead man's fingers, or you may potentially get extremely sick. Once the whole crab is cleaned out, wash it out with clean water and soak it in a weak bleach water mixture for around 10 to 15 minutes, 1 part bleach to 9 parts water. This kills any remaining bacteria and removes any smell left behind. Then, rinse thoroughly to remove any traces of flesh and or bleach, and after that it should look like this, pictured on screen. This second image being all the parts laid out. Once the crab is like this, you need to dry out the shell, which can be done in a few ways. First being to leave it out in a dry, warm room. Second, using a hairdryer to dry the parts. Third, putting them in a very warm, dry cupboard. I have a hot water tank in a small closet in a room in my home which does exactly this. I used all 3 of these methods to quickly dry out the specimen, but do keep in mind some types of crustacean may, and I quote, fold up during this process. I had this exact issue happen when taxidermying a lobster with previous attempts. The head curled inwards, so I had to create a basic wooden support from sticks to prevent this. As you can see in this image provided, the left head was not given a stick while the one on the right was. But anyway, once the crab is completely dry, you can begin the taxidermy process. However, do note that you want to minimize drying time as to prevent the growth of mold. However, you also don't want to dry out the shell too quickly or else it will crack, splinter and break, which is why I suggested the 3 methods provided. Anyway, moving on, first part you want to taxidermy is the legs. Begin this by organizing the leg parts into their proper configurations and orientations and plan out what goes where. For future context, in this specimen the back left leg was missing, so it only has 7 instead of 8. Here I'll show what a fully assembled leg looks like on a brown crab. Also, during the actual taxidermy process of stuffing and assembling the leg, try to avoid getting super glue on any of the joints as to only soak the paper inside, which will prevent the joints from locking up and becoming unposable. Anyway, putting the actual legs together, once you have all your parts organized, you're going to want to cut tissue paper or stuffing into thin strips, twist it to form spirals and cut a length of wire 1/3 longer than what the finished limb will be. From this point, we are starting with the foot. You place it on the end of the wire, twist some paper in, and glue it into place. Once the foot is secured to the end of the wire, cut off the excess paper, or stuffing of your choice. Once the glue is dried and the foot is set in place, follow these steps. 1. Place the next leg part on, in the correct orientation with the joints lined up. 2. Stuff it with tissue paper, just like the foot. 3. Once it's filled with paper, super glue it in place and let it dry. Then simply repeat this 3-step process with each section of each limb. I will show pictures that illustrate this process. Final result, all the limbs should be done with a length of wire protruding from the back. Albeit I advise attaching the hip joint last after you figure out which hip socket matches to which limb. Once all the joints are attached, trim the wire down to around 1.5 or 2 inches from the hip joint. Once you are done, the finished limbs should look like these. And now with your legs complete, we can move on to the claws. Much like the legs, the first step is to organize the claw parts. When you have them all laid out, start with the mobile digit by stuffing it and creating a protrusion like this with the wire. Said wire should extend as far into the tip of the claw as possible. Once that's in, glued and set, stuff the main claw, slide the wire in and carefully relocate the claw joint by lifting it upwards and pressing it into the joint. Once it's done, it should look like this. And you should be able to close and open the claw without it falling out. With that, now you need to use 3 to 4 lengths of wire, cut them to length and slide them into both the lower and upper arm of the specimen. After this, open the joints, stuff them firmly with paper, put glue inside and push the arms together. The finished stuffed claw should look like this. Once it's complete, simply repeat this process with the other arm. Now with the arms done, we can move on to the body. This process is fairly easy. Start by stuffing the central pelvic area with tissues and we can begin with the arms being attached first. Said arms are put on easily by connecting the base of its joint back into the shoulder socket. After this, stuff it with paper and glue them into place at the base. These provided images showing you how it should look. The base of the arm should be firmly attached. And with those, now to explain how the legs are inserted. Once the arms are securely fixed in place, flip the crab on its back and begin attaching the legs. Much like the arms, each leg socket has a point where it was once connected previously. Simply line these up, slide the wire in and they should fit in naturally. Once they're lined up, simply glue the hip sockets into place. While these hip sockets will become inflexible, it's advised you pre-pose the crab's limbs at their base before you actually do this. Anyway, with the limbs attached, the underside should look like this. Before the glue dries, make any necessary adjustments quickly. Once all is dry and set, flip the specimen over and simply line up the top shell, then gently press it into place. And that gives you the end result. Your crab is now done. But do keep in mind, due to how front heavy this species is, I had to create something to help keep him upright on display as shown in these final images. Which brings us on to the conclusion. Now that your taxidermy crab is finished, it's ready for display. Here I have him beside an earlier taxidermy project, a lobster I made last year. I decided to name them fittingly Eugene and Larry. Larry on the right here being my first actual attempt at taxidermy on a crustacean. As you can see, his claws are broken from having to cut them open and extract all the flesh, and they're on the wrong sides. Since then my method was refined and I no longer need to cut them open. Instead I used the aforementioned 2 tools I mentioned earlier to take out everything. Speaking of which, you may have noticed these which came out of the crab's claws during the removal of all the flesh and muscle. These are tendons that muscles in the claw connect to. They pull the claw shut and are what give the crab such grip strength. They, during the assembly process, do not need to go back into him. Instead, just put them among other miscellaneous crab parts or put them next to him, doesn't really matter. Albeit in my case, they've been put among the other miscellaneous crustacean parts I've stored up over time. All accumulated from my research into taxidermy and crustaceans. But ultimately with that brings us to the end. And with that, I conclude this guide on brown crab taxidermy. I do hope your efforts in such are successful, and what you've learned here is useful if you wish to perform this on, for example, a blue crab, Dungeness crab, stone crab, or whatever species captures your interest. Albeit, there's not much else to say, so that concludes this guide. Goodbye.